what I've been doing a podcast for a while, and various people have been asking me questions about how to get a podcast started, Myron Edmonds. And so I said today, I didn't have the time to write something down. And I said, this would probably be an easier way to do this by having someone ask me questions. Now, I will say this as my first disclaimer. I am not a podcast expert, but I believe in whatever I've learned to share. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Whatever I've learned, I'm sharing it. And so today, if you're watching this, go ahead and share it on your Facebook so that others can see it. And if you're watching this even as a playback, go ahead and share it so that others can kind of get a feel of what's going on this interview today. And I'm also going to just put a link right there in the comments below so that you can check out my podcast, because all of the videos that we do here, we take them and we make them into audio files, and we put them up on iTunes and other places for podcasts. So that's the link that you'll see down below in the comments for a podcast. And I'm just going to show it on the screen a little bit for those of you who are watching this. It's KimoneHinds.com/Ideas2Life. All right. Well, Toussaint, take it away. Let's go.
Man, Kimon, this is, an awesome privilege. I've been, watching from a distance, the podcast and learning. And you mentioned, just some things that are actually really simple to do. And I was like, man, how does he do this? And so when we talked earlier about the possibility of, actually interviewing you and seeing, how do you do this? How do you come up with this? It's one thing knowing somebody, but then being able to get behind the scenes and see what are the machinations and actually go into putting on this podcast on a weekly basis. And so I just want to say thank you for allowing me to come and just pick your brain. You say, I don't know a whole lot about this, but for me, you're like a professional. So that's exciting. I feel like I'm taking notes here as well. So I'm excited about what we're going to learn. I'm sure other folks on the that follow your podcast are going to be able to glean as well. So I'm excited to be able to interview the interviewer. So
that's cool. That's cool. And those of you watching this, if you have questions, please put them in the comment box, because we want to try to answer other people's questions as well. So those of you watching would love to hear your questions as well.
So let me just ask you this from the beginning, how it got started. We see or hear the podcast, we watch, a Facebook Live, but what was the idea behind Ideas to Life? As your brainchild, how did that happen?
Sure. Let me take you back a little bit. Ideas to Life is actually my fourth podcast that I've started. I was a consumer of podcasts. I was listening to other people's podcasts for years through different churches, different leaders. And I work along with this organization called PELC, Pastoral Evangelism and Leadership Conference. And we said we wanted to expand the reach of PELC outside of just a yearly event. For those who don't know, PELC usually gathers pastors together every December on the campus of Oakwood University in Huntsville. And so we said, how can we resource pastors outside of that? And the idea that I pitched to our leader, Dr. Wilson, was, hey, let's do a podcast. And he said, that's a great idea. Go ahead and do it. And so that podcast got started maybe about 3 years ago. Based on that conversation, we said, how can we resource pastors? Well, I started doing that, interviewing people. And, I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but you're doing something, just kind of testing it out. And you realize, man, I'm liking this, and I feel like I'm developing some skills in this skill of interviewing, asking questions. And so about a year ago, probably a year and a half ago, I started thinking about all the things that I do in my ministry, personally helping out people. And I said, the thing that I do is I bring ideas to life. And I wanted to find a way to do something that is my passion, but I'm doing it not just for an organization that I work for, the church that I work for, but I'm doing it sort of an outgrowth of who I am. And so Ideas to Life got started. And naturally, because podcasting was something I was doing, I said, I'd love to do a podcast to tell people stories that I've seen, I've interacted with, I've observed, how they came up with the idea that they had. That's one thing that I've heard people comment and say, you come up with great ideas, as a compliment to me. But I said, there is something behind good ideas. There is something behind how people think about, strategize, plan, and then eventually implement good ideas. And so the podcast, which we started maybe around April of 2016, Ideas to Life, was an attempt for me to tell good stories and to inspire people by those stories.
Man, Kimon, that's just that's inspiring to me, you know, because a lot of times, you know, I have ideas, but it seems like, oh, it's just an idea, or it's too far beyond my reach, or it just may not be, I'm not sure how to channel it. But if you're saying, you know, you just went out, had some ideas and just started moving forward, and just beginning that process, it sparked more ideas.
Right.
And that's how we got the idea, the Ideas to Life. So that's exciting. I mean, a lot of us, you know, that are watching, that have things that we're thinking about are possible that we can do. Man, it's possible to do something and do something well. But I also noticed you said it took about 4 years. You've been doing this for 4 years. So what we're seeing is not initially just brand new, but you've been working at this behind the scenes, per se, before you got on your own podcast. Right.
Yeah. You know, I did. I think every person who records their services at a local church should start a podcast. You know, I remember we were selling CDs and, you know, doing that. And any church that's ever tried selling CDs knows that's a headache of trying to figure out, when do we collect money? When do we give people their CDs? We have CDs no one wants to buy. And we just simply said, let's figure out how we can put this up on the internet, put it on our website, and then put it on iTunes, so that people out there in the general market can find our services and begin listening to them on the go. Because that's what's up. That's what a podcast really is. It's like mobile content. It's content on the go where people can listen to it as they go, as they walk, as they run, as they drive. And so we did that, just taking my sermons, putting it up there. And we felt like that was we got some good responses from that, because I was listening to other people's sermons. So I figured, hey, maybe I'll put mine out there and see.
Yes. So in a sense, you haven't changed the message. You're just simply shifting the medium and being able to put it in a place where people can get it on a regular basis. Absolutely. You know, yeah. You see somebody saying, what's up? Hey, Toussaint, how you doing? Yeah. You know, interestingly, if my sermons are being sold at my church, then you have to attend my church service to get one most times. If it's on my website, you have to come to my website to get it. But if it's on iTunes, it's in a market where people who are just looking around for content can find it. And so that's what I feel the power of a podcast is. You don't have to know me to find my podcast. You just have to be looking for content in an area where I'm providing content in order to interact with me. Well, I think content is a good segue to my next question. How do you build content? I know you said you have ideas, but you know, your podcast is not just Kimon Hinds and every week you sit down and talk, but you're actually going and looking or creating, giving us content. What are some of the, not just the ideas, but the steps from, I have an idea for a particular content to putting it out on the actual podcast? Sure.
That's a good question. There are a few steps. I think one of them that you first have to choose is what is going to be your persona on your podcast. And let me explain what that means. You know, my podcast, I am a student. So what that means is for every episode, I am asking questions of people and getting your responses. I am in the position of a learner trying to hear from others what their expertise is, what their experience is, kind of what their inspiration is. So I take the position of a student on my podcast. Now, there's some others who do podcasts and they take the position of a sage. And a sage is someone who is, their persona in that podcast is, here is what I know, let me share it with you. So they may be the only person on the podcast, and they are going to get 30 minutes and they'll be talking about leadership, they'll be talking about family, they'll be talking about finances. But you understand, when you listen to a Dave Ramsey podcast, for instance, this is Dave sharing about good money management. He takes a position of a sage. And then there's some other people who might take the position of a sidekick. And a sidekick is simply, for some podcasts that are very popular, you have two people. You have a host and a co-host. And the role of that co-host is simply to be funny, to add humor, to interpret what the other person might be saying if they get too technical. But you have two people, and one takes the role maybe of a sage and the other takes the role of a sidekick. So before you start your podcast, you have to figure out, okay, what is this podcast? What's my role going to be? Am I going to be a student asking questions? Am I going to be a sage where I just share from my knowledge? And am I going to require a sidekick, someone who's going to be on my podcast with me every week, and we're just going to banter? You know, I have a friend, this as a side note, His name is Peyton Jones, and he has the most listened to podcast for church planters. And Peyton will tell you that when you get on, he has a sidekick, Pete Mitchell. And when you get onto their podcast for the first 30 minutes, they're just bantering, they're just joking around. And for some people, you wonder, okay, can we just get to the meat and the potatoes? But his whole point is for people who are in a very high stress job as church planting, they need that sort of bantering. They need that release. And so his podcast has gotten really popular because he has a role and Pete has a role of sidekick. And so it makes it really, really interesting. So first of all, you kind of just decide what's your persona on your podcast. And then the second thing you'll need is some good tools. And I know we're going to talk about that, but Chip Dizard, who a lot of people know, he is a technology specialist. Chip helped me out with the Pelt podcast when I first started. The first podcast interview I did was of Dr. Wilson, Dr. Jesse Wilson. And Chip was telling me I needed to get a microphone. I needed to get different things. And of course, just like all of us, I tried to cut some corners. So I said, I'm not getting a microphone just yet. I'm just going to use my computer, use the built-in microphone. I'm going to record it. I needed to get some questions, and that's something that we'll talk about some more, how to plan your podcast episode. But I just interviewed Dr. Wilson, and I will tell you, it was the best content, but it was the worst production. Like the sound was bad. You were hearing echoes. And the challenge at the end of it was the quality was so bad that no one would listen to what the content was. And so we actually had to scrap that episode and we had to redo it. And I'll say it now. I don't think we did it as well. Just the quality, the content wasn't great, but the quality was so much better. So don't cut corners. Get you some good stuff.
I am going to ask you about tools, and I want you to be like our Chip. This Chip was for you, for us. But you mentioned something I really want to just kind of focus on. You mentioned between a sage and a student. As a listener to your podcast, I always felt like I was along the journey with you, but I never knew it was intentional. I'm thinking, man, I'm just learning. But you're actually saying, as I'm starting a podcast, that the direction, even though I don't, as I'm working and creating on content, should kind of funnel or fuel the direction of the actual podcast.
That's right. I think there's room in the podcast space, in the digital content creation space for both. I think there's room for people who are sages, people who will tell you, hey, this is how I do this, and be unapologetic about it. Because if you have good knowledge and good information on something, share it boldly, share it, widely. Don't hesitate on it. And then there's some times where you need someone to be your voice in talking to a sage. You need someone to almost ask the questions that you would ask if you had a chance to talk to them. And that's what I feel my role is. My role is to ask questions of people that if you were the one with the microphone or you were the one behind the camera, you would want to ask them the same questions.
So let's touch on tools. I'm a new podcaster. I have some ideas. I have the position of whether sage or student, so I kind of know where I want to go. But what do I need practically outside of my ideas to actually get it off the ground? Like what are the, you said, not using my computer as a microphone, but not everybody has, the money that Kimon has to be able to go out and we know you have big time dollars over there in Memphis, but what are some of the initial tools that basics that I need to actually have a quality podcast?
Sure. So first of all, again, you will need a program to record your audio on, you'll need a way to record audio. If you are simply recording and both people are in the same place, one of the tools that you can use, if you're a Mac person, it's GarageBand. And if you're someone on the PC side, it's Audacity. I'm going to try to put the name Audacity so that my accent doesn't stop you from knowing how to spell it. But it's Audacity, and it should come up on the screen pretty soon.
Got it.
Yeah. So Audacity is that program for the PC side. Now, that's if you are just simply recording, you're at home, you're the only one. That's the program you use to record and also to do some of your editing, your audio editing of your podcast. Microphone. I went out and did some research today so that I can drop some stuff in here. I use an Audio Technica microphone, and they should be paying me for some of this stuff here because I am giving them some free advertising. We're going to work on that another time. But this is the microphone that I use here, and it's an Audio Technica microphone 2020, and it's simply one where it allows me to get rid of, the sounds on the outside. You can click on that link if you're in the comments below, and you can go to Amazon and see that it's not that expensive, about $100 for that microphone. And there's some other comparable microphones, and you can do your research on that. But that microphone simply plugs into my laptop. It allows it to capture my voice in a quality way and get rid of things like plosives and those things, so that it's a clearer sound for those listening. One of the things that Chip helped me out with, and he said to me, and you hear me reference Chip a lot, it was more important for me to have good sound than the person I was interviewing, because people would be much more understanding and much more gracious with those who are being interviewed than the person doing the interview, because you're the one whose voice they're hearing over and over, and they need to know that you have some sort of quality behind what you're saying. So you need a microphone, you need something to sort of edit and capture that podcasting stuff, such as GarageBand or Audacity, and another tool just for those you might be interviewing someone at a distance from you, so you're calling them. I use Skype Recorder. So you get Skype, you purchase some Skype minutes, and you record. There's a program called Skype Recorder that you download. And with Skype Recorder, whenever you do a Skype call, you can always record it, get the audio, and take that audio and drop it into GarageBand. And it does a very good job of capturing high quality between your call from your computer to the other person that you're talking to.
Now, hold on a second. If I'm hearing you correctly, we're transitioning from content to actually what are some of the nuts and bolts to actually getting this podcast off the ground. Sure. So what I'm hearing is this more than just, hey, me hit play or find a nice microphone and hitting play. There's actually an element of editing, mixing that going into that. Can you touch on that a little bit? Well, let me first ask you this: how long is your typical interview? And then how long does it take from interview to actually getting up to where what we as end users hear?
Sure. So my typical interview that I shoot for is between 30 to 40 minutes. There have been a few that's been a little shorter than 30, and a few that have gone over 40 minutes. But I try to keep it within that 30 to 40 minute range. I tell the people in the beginning that we're going to shoot for 30 minutes. And of course, for some people, the interviews are going so well, we both lose track of time. At least they do. But I kind of keep a handle on the time to know we're not going to go beyond 42 minutes for the interview. But at the end of that, if I'm doing it on Skype, or if I'm doing it as we're doing this interview now on Facebook Live, one of the things that I have to do at the end is take that audio, bring it into GarageBand, and I have to listen through the audio to see if there are any spots that if sound went out, or if the quality went out. And there's sometimes I'll have to listen and cut some stuff out, just like you might do in any other document. You are doing some cutting and some pasting, some taking out of stuff, and so I'll go and listen through for quality and taking out of stuff and smoothing of some things. And there'll be some times where I might have asked a question that I realized, okay, that was a question really no one is interested in. I'll take out that whole section. Or someone might go on, like I'm going on with this answer, and I say, okay, that was enough. Let me take it. But that process may take about an hour or so just to listen through the podcast and edit it down for quality and to make sure I have a good audio file. So that's about an hour for a 30 to 40 minute thing. And I've gotten better. So it used to take a little bit longer, but now it's taking me about an hour on that. I will say I do take about another hour. Let's just say I record for about 30 to 40 minutes, and it takes me 2 hours to do all the editing work at the end. The second time through, I'm listening for what is in the podcast, because I do something called show notes. So I try to take out of the podcast what are the highlights, so that when people are looking on the blog, they're looking on my website, they can see the highlights of the podcast. And I realize that's like a best practice I see with other podcasts. People love to pull it out so that when you look at it, you say, let me go listen to this based on the highlights that I'm seeing here.
Got you. I think that's a really good technical component. Now let me shift gears to what I found very interesting. Just how do you select the people that you interview? I mean, you're a pastor and you come across a lot of people, but your podcast isn't just for pastors. You talk to authors, radio hosts, a number of people. But how do you decide that? And what is the process of getting people? Because you got some very influential people on your podcast. How does that happen?
Okay. All right. And then I see a question by Toussaint. So we'll get to that question in a little bit, Toussaint. So the first few people that I had on my podcast were people who were locally here in Memphis, who I'd become friends with. I admired what they were doing, and I thought they would be great people for my podcast. And probably about 1/3 of the people who I've interviewed have been friends whose work I've admired. People who I've already known, but in knowing them, I've always wondered, how did they come up with that idea? And I'm sure those who are watching this, those who will listen to this, you go through that process when you look at different people's work. You say, man, that was a great thought. How did they even think of that? So those were people I'd initially tap into, friends. And then as I started doing it, I've gotten people who had said to me, why not interview so-and-so? Wouldn't that be a great person to interview? So I've gotten people who are friends, and I've gotten some referrals. People would say, this person would be a great person to interview for your podcast. So for everyone who's ever referred me to someone else, thank you, because I could not have had people for good interviews without you. And then there are just others I've seen on media or just, in various parts who I thought, oh, this person would be great. And I think I'd come to another part of your question. I just thought to myself, this would be a good person to ask for my podcast, and went about the process of asking. And I can tell you how that goes.
Don't speed past that. You got to help us out, man. You're saying you're talking to folks, and because I see the initial part. We start with somebody that I'm close to, I connect with. But you've actually gone past your circle and outside of referrals. But man, how do you? Come on, you gotta give us more than just I just reached out to. What does that process look like?
Right. So let me use one for example. Willie Moore Jr. Willie Moore Jr. is a radio personality. He's on television on BET with Ty Tribbett. Written a book. He's on tour with Eric Thomas. And I've met Willie Moore Jr. a couple times, but not enough for me to say that's my friend. So I reached out to him via email, because most people who are public figures, they'll have an email, they'll have a website to contact them. But I reached out via email. And what I simply did was I gave an overview of my podcast, because I'd had some interviews already, gave an overview of my podcast. I said what the podcast was doing. I told him the time slot that I was looking for in terms of the amount of time that I wanted to interview him, which was 30 minutes. And then I just made the ask. I'd love to have you on my podcast so I can tell your story to my listeners. Now, of course, I didn't communicate with Willie Moore Jr. I communicated with his manager. And she, what is interesting, I've found in just doing a podcast and doing different things, is simply having a podcast or being someone that creates content gives you some credibility with people. People listen to you. They respect your work. They give you a hearing when ordinarily they wouldn't, just because you are doing something. Now, if you never did an interview before and you're saying, I want you to be my first guest, I think it would be a lot more difficult to get someone like him. But because I'd probably had about 7 or 8, and when I interviewed him, I probably had about 8. But I didn't tell him that. I didn't tell them that. I just told him I have a podcast. This is who I interview. And as I've gone along the way, another tip that I'll share with you, when I'm asking people now, I refer them to people who are in a similar vein as them that I've interviewed in the past. So for someone who might be in service enterprises, people who are doing work with relieving different needs in the world, I'll talk about people that I've interviewed. So when I send them an email, which is I try to make it as professionally written as possible. I have a template for that. I'll say to them, I've interviewed Zach Hunter, who was a young man trying to relieve slavery in the world, modern day slavery. I've interviewed someone who started rise against hunger to alleviate hunger. And I'd love to interview you about what you're doing to fix this need in the world. So just talking about different people you've interviewed gives you also a door for new interviews.
And speaking of interviews, you've done a number now from your 8, and I actually like the idea of actually having something before you go into people that you don't necessarily know, having some type of content, having some type of notches on the belt before you connect with folks that are outside of your immediate circle. Tell us, man, in front of all of your listeners, who was your favorite interview? What was your favorite?
So I have 3 children. That's like asking me who's my favorite child, right?
Yeah. So tell us which one. Which one is it, Jaden?
So I've enjoyed. I have enjoyed every interview I've done. I've taken something from every interview that I've done, and there's some that I'll say have gotten responses from people. So maybe I'll share.
Okay, yeah, responses.
I think one of them that has gotten a lot of great responses was the interview I did with Amber Wright. Amber is a communication coach. And I think what resonated with people was Amber sharing how something that she was always good at as a child, communicating, telling stories, how it became what she studied in school. And then she talked about her journey of, putting together what I've always been good at, what I've studied, and now making it a calling in life. And I think Amber really resonated with people as well because she has a very bubbly personality. So that's one that I feel people resonated with. And then the other that I'll say that got probably the best response from people close to me was the interview I did with Mo Bridges and his mom, Tramika Morris. Mo Bridges is a young man who is 15 years old, and Mo has a $1 million company doing bow ties.
Got you. Okay, I remember it.
Yeah, he does handcrafted bow ties. Learned his mom, he wanted to dress well, and his mom was like, okay, you need to actually start doing something to make these things that you like. And so his mom saw what he liked, inspired him to get started. And his story is one that doesn't just relate to people who are older. It relates to children as well. And it's kind of helped me to kind of even begin helping to see what my children are interested in and begin channeling them. So those are 2 that I'll share that have gotten good responses. And really, I think every story has resonated with someone, but those are just some that people have given good feedback on. All
right. So I'm going to spare you, and I'm not going to ask you what was your worst podcast, but let's just say I'm doing a podcast and it doesn't go well, but it's my only content. You put out a weekly content. What do you do if I'm doing a podcast? I have the right speakers. I've gone through the editing process, but I'm listening to it and it's just, hit a dud. How do I put it out there? Do I continue going, or do I scrap it and miss a week? Because I know that does consistency make a difference? But what do you do when you don't have something that you don't feel like is as good as the other ones?
That's a good question. I think you have a few options. I'm going to tell you some of your options you have. I think I would not just put out bad content, because what's so interesting is for many people, you're judged on the episode that they listen to. So that may just be the one that they happen to come across on their timeline this week on Facebook, on Twitter, or whatever. And they listen to that and they go, oh, this podcast isn't hitting on anything. So you got to be real careful on putting out bad stuff. But I think if you have maybe a 35-minute interview, you might have some inspiration inside of there that may be 15 minutes long. I would pull out the 15 good minutes in there, and then you have the option of recording something on the front end and on the back end of it to sort of make it a little bit longer. So you can start with an opening, share some information, say, I want to give you some of what we had in this interview with Dr. Toussaint Williams, share the 15 minutes that are really good, and then come on the back and recap what you heard and then give them a charge. So you can take content from inside of something that wasn't all good and make it work for you.
Got you. So when you're saying when I put here this podcast, if it's only 15 minutes, the one that I've done with you, man, I just know I bombed. I'm just saying.
Yeah, it might be 5.
Yeah, just might be 5. Oh man, hey, I know you have a number of responsibilities outside of the podcast. I want to get to Short's question. Let's just jump into hers real quick, if you don't mind. Go ahead.
All right. It says, you want to read it or you want me to read it?
I'll read it. Do you think it's best to have a general podcast with various subjects or stick to a particular brand like finances, marriage? You know, how broad do I get in the podcast? Good question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think as much as possible to answer your question, you want to get a niche. You want to get something that is a common thread for all your episodes, because people kind of tend to look to podcasts and these kind of, digital on-demand things based on a particular need. So if this person is having financial challenges, they're going to be looking for a financial podcast. If you're having relationship, or they want to take your relationship to another level, they'll be looking for that. So if you are coming out with content, you want to scratch where that person itches, because what they'll do is they'll tell someone else, hey, this podcast is helping me with my finances. Now, in mine, there is a common thread of creativity, innovation, how you implement things in mine. But there is some variety. I have authors, I have speakers, I have entrepreneurs, I have ministers, and I try to have that common thread of how did you get started? How do you deal with challenges? And, what inspiration can you give for others? So you can have variety, but you have to have a niche in the middle of, that kind of keeps that variety, together. So that's my suggestion to you. And as much as you can define your niche, I think that helps as much as possible.
All right. I saw another question, just simply, what program are you using to record this? Going back to the tool section, what program are you using to record this interview? Cool.
Great. Somebody asking that right now. There's a program called BeLive.tv. Found this a little while ago. I'm always, let me just tell you, my podcast now is not the same as my podcast a year and a half ago, and it's not going to be the same a year and a half from now. I'm always looking to improve, and I think with everything, you have to say, okay, this is as good as I am now, but it's not as good as I'm going to be. So I saw someone interviewing someone online on Facebook, and I'm realizing that Facebook is the most visited website. So they were doing that interview. It looked professional. You see the lower thirds. You can throw the questions up on there. I said, wow, wouldn't that be great to do some interviews using Facebook Live? Well, after I did one, I realized I can get the audio from that and use it for my podcast. And so for the last few episodes, I've been trying this out. It's called BeLive.tv. You can get it from just go to BeLive.tv. You can actually sample it for a little while before you buy it. So check it out, see if it works for you. And then you can always grab the audio from off of your Facebook, and just put this on YouTube as well. So I use content in various ways. It'll end up on my blog, end up in my podcast, end up on my YouTube channel, end up on my Facebook. So yeah.
I saw another question here. If I were to start a podcast, it would probably be my wife, maybe my wife, my mom, a couple of brothers may watch it. But how do you drive people to your podcast? Like, how do you get people to listen outside of people that just, that know you or just want to support you? And, how do you do that?
Very good question. And one that I'm still working on. So some of the lessons that I've learned for this podcast, for the next podcast I will start, is that the first 8 weeks of you doing a podcast is very important.
Okay.
iTunes, and these are just various places that people listen to podcasts. iTunes is the most popular one. Google Play is very popular. Stitcher is very popular. But iTunes in particular, for 8 weeks, they have something where if your podcast is getting a buzz, they'll bump you up and they'll feature you for people who come to their store in something called New and Noteworthy. Well, I missed out on that because I didn't know. But there are a few ways that you can get noticed there. One, have good podcast art. They'll tell you the features you need. Get some good art so that it's appealing to people.
Art, like actual
art. Yeah. Get some good art for your podcast, because even though people are listening to it, they'll kind of see it. And if it visually grabs them as a new podcast, kind of helps to get your buzz.
Almost like a thumbnail for your.
There you go. Thumbnail. Okay. Thank you. The other thing that I think is good for you to do is to begin, before you put out your first episode, to begin to build a buzz for your podcast. Letting people know, hey, a new podcast is coming. You can begin even sharing some of the features of that podcast, but begin getting people looking forward to what's coming. Another thing you need to do is, in every episode, encourage people to do a few things. You want to encourage them to like it. You want to encourage them to share your podcast. You want to encourage them to subscribe, because you want to move people from just being consumers to being part of your advertising. So for my podcast, to answer your question, Kevin, I put it out on social media. That's my main way of getting my podcast out there. I put it out on my social media sites, Facebook, I use Twitter, I use Instagram, and I'm realizing I need to start using a little bit more LinkedIn, because LinkedIn, for my brand of podcasts, which is for entrepreneurs and stuff, LinkedIn is very good for people who are looking for improving themselves, looking for bettering themselves in business. So it's a good place to post content for your podcast on LinkedIn. Go ahead.
No, I just jump in there. So what you're saying is even how I share my podcast kind of drives my content drives the vehicle with which I drive my podcast.
Right. Absolutely.
LinkedIn versus Facebook, or I'm sure imagine other areas that have social media have good venues, but it depends on what type of folks I'm trying to address or touch.
Right. And then you also have to, I think part of building an audience for a podcast is also building a tribe, building people who are following what you're doing. And so one of the things I recently did was I developed an email list. I gave away something, started an email list using MailChimp. Every few weeks, I'll email those people and say our newest episodes are out. Because I just realized there's some people who will like a podcast, but they're not on my Facebook. They're not on Facebook, following me on Facebook. They're not even in that Facebook world, but everybody has email. So you have to make sure you're doing a few different things. Social media, different brands of social media, an email list, building your tribe, building a following. And then when people listen to your podcast, always giving them that call to action, subscribe, like, and share it. What's great, when someone shares it, your listenership goes up exponentially, because not only the people you're connected to can listen to it, but the people they're connected to can listen to it.
So that's, I guess, trying to engage people in being a part of the podcast where listeners are not just consumers, but they're actually part of enhancing the promotion of the product. And I think that's powerful, because I really think it's more than just an interview, but it's like, man, how can I get this to the world, and how can the world participating with me? I mean, participate in sharing that with others.
Huh.
Yeah.
We'll skip that question.
One more question. Man, dude, you have a full-time job. You have 3 beautiful kids. You have a wife, and you added this podcast. How do you juggle with it? You said, you take an hour for the podcast itself, 3 hours for publication or editing. And then you said, there's other social media areas. How do you do this? You had with your full-time job, and just how do you juggle all of those areas?
Sure. That's a good question. And I think this kind of goes to anyone who is trying to create content and really just use the various parts of your gifts. I think, first of all, I have to realize that even though I have a full-time job, my job isn't all of my life. And doing this podcast actually helps to give life to the things that I do for my job. It gives new ideas. It gives new inspiration. So I've realized that this helps me even in my full-time job. Secondly, I try to, as much as possible, do my editing work and the major time-consuming parts of my podcast on Mondays, because Mondays are my day off. I'm a pastor of 2 churches. And so, take the weekend. Monday, my wife says it's really not a day off, but I say, well, I'm doing work for me.
Yes.
So I do most of my editing work on Monday. And then I sort of schedule my social media posts to show up on Tuesday mornings. I'll do some stuff on Thursday, but those are scheduled so that even though it may come off to people as if I'm posting the stuff, I'm taking time to do that. A lot of that is scheduled, and there are a lot of scheduling software that you can use to schedule that stuff out for your social media posts, so that when people see it, you're trying to get the optimum time for them to see it. You're not necessarily you're sitting at your computer, hitting share and hitting posts and stuff.
So I think there was a question that just came up. I want to address that.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Okay. Put up so our listeners can see it.
Yeah.
How do you prepare for an interview? I have somebody I want to talk to. How do I prepare? you interview beforehand, before offline, before asking the question the first time?
Sure. Again, I'm always go back to Chip. Chip Desire told me a great practice, best practice, is to have a list of questions, a template of questions that you use for each interview. So for each interview, I basically have about 9 questions that I ask. Now, everyone doesn't get asked them the same way, doesn't get asked the same 9 questions. So my questions always kind of flow from where did the idea start? What are some of your challenges? What is inspiration you can give to people? But I ask that to different people in different ways. But before we ever have an interview, whether it's by phone, whether it's on Facebook Live, each person I interview, I send them a list of questions beforehand to prepare them for what I'm going to ask them. I send them some stuff beforehand so that they can have a better idea of how to be prepared. And just like we're doing this interview, you sent me some questions beforehand because I wanted to make sure that I had an idea where we're going. Now, of course, I tell everyone when we're doing the interview that if you say something and it sparks a follow-up question, that I will ask you a follow-up question. Everyone has been very gracious about that. I think everyone understands once you're talking about something, you can't just leave stuff without getting some resolution. So we do that. We do follow-up questions. Another tool that I use is a scheduler, because I found in the beginning, I would ask someone, can I interview you? And I would suggest, can we do it next week? What is a good time for you? And then they would say, okay, what about Monday at 10? And I'd say, well, Monday at 10, I have an appointment. What about 2? We'd be going back and forth. And that's really frustrating if you're trying to get busy people who are doing great things. So I use a scheduler now called Calendly. And I'm going to type how that's spelled. So that
one of our future sponsors, right?
Yeah. So Calendly is a way, Calendly.com is a way for you to set up a calendar for your podcast, for your interviews, and the people who are on it you can give them the blocks. They can go in. You can set your available times. They can go in and they can pick some of the times that are available to you, that are available to them. And then it will eventually just show up on my calendar and give me a reminder. So I don't have to do the back and forth with them. I send them questions beforehand. I send them the Calendly link so that we both can have it on our calendars. And when it's that time, we're ready to go.
All right, a couple questions before we get out of here. Man, you mentioned challenges. What are some challenges that you face with creating the podcast? And then my next question is going to be, man, what would you do to inspire some folks that are listening on right now? They've been watching, they're following you. Inspire us to, put some ideas to life.
Sure.
So first of all, the challenges.
Okay. The challenge is the challenge of expectation. My challenge is I've had a dream, and I think we all, when we do something, we want mass amount of people watching and a mass amount of people listening and, a lot of downloads. And so my challenge has been that my podcast has not ever hit my level of expectation. And probably the challenge was my expectation was a little too high. Wondering when I would get to 1 million downloads, just for instance.
Yeah.
But I'm going to tell you what has helped me. I've realized that there was a time a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine who I grew up with in New York, he called me. He said, I just discovered your podcast and I've been listening to it. And it has helped me as I've been trying to figure out what I'm doing next and what God is calling me to do and what I'm wired and I'm shaped to do. And every testimony like that has been inspiration to keep going, because every person who gets an episode and it inspires them to take action is success. Because that's really why I started the podcast. I could change and say, no, I really wanted to start this podcast to make money, but that was never my intent. I really just wanted to tell good stories to inspire people so that they could release the ideas that they've been thinking about and put them into practice. And so the challenge with everyone who's doing this is a challenge of discouragement, where you wonder, am I making a difference? Is anyone watching? Is anyone listening? But I want to just encourage you as you take the step of creating content, whether it's a podcast, writing a blog, doing a video channel, just something, teaching something, that if it's one person that is being inspired and affected by what you're doing, man, you're successful. And that one person will develop into 2 and 4 and 16, it'll be exponential. So,
brother, you gotta pause you, man. You mentioned a source of inspiration. You said there's a possibility of making money.
Yes.
So once we get off, I'll give you my address so you can send my check. But is there a monetary is remuneration involved in creating a podcast? Does iTunes send me a check? How does that work?
Sure. So there are ways to make money in doing podcasts. In fact, I know people who that's their full-time job, making money doing podcasts. You got someone saying hello to you, Pastor Toussaint.
I see.
Yeah.
Hey, Kim.
Yeah. There are a few ways. One is through advertising. So your podcast is listened to by enough people. There'll be people who will want to be featured on your episodes. You can say, my microphone today is a microphone by Audio Technica to answer Ralph's question. So you can say we're using SoundCloud, and you just begin to promote the various people, and people who are connected into what you're doing, they'll want to be featured in your podcast if you have a certain amount of listeners and that kind of stuff, the metrics. There's also something that someone mentioned, and I just lost it. But it's a way for you to have different people to link into your podcast and to say they want to support you and whatever. And if I had the name of it, it was on the tip of my tongue and I just lost it.
You put on show notes, man. You put on the show notes.
It'll be in the show notes. But yeah, it's a way for people who are following your podcast to say, okay, I want to support you. And it can be just family members and friends and others. They can just do that. So there's some ways, advertisers, just small supporters doing that. But I found, and I'll just say, I have not made any money with my podcast, but it has opened some doors for me. Recently, I had a chance to go to Houston, Texas, to do an interview for a conference called Fruition. And the only reason I was asked to do that is because I have a podcast. I interview people. The person who was putting on the conference felt like I asked good questions. And so I got an opportunity to go there to rub shoulders with some great people, hear some inspiring things there, and interview people after they did their presentations, only because I had a podcast that I was doing something similar. So it has opened doors for me. And it also has given me an opportunity, as I've listened to this, to begin to pull stuff out of each of my interviews that I'm eventually wanting to make into some resources.
Man, so that's awesome. So even if it's not a monetary gift that you're receiving, there's also just doors and opportunities that open that lead to other opportunities. And it's just a matter of what I'm hearing you say, just getting started, going through the basic steps, identifying who your audience is, your type of vehicle that you're going to use to reach them, and then just watching doors open and watch ideas literally become, life. Yeah.
One other thing I'll say is I think you need to also have a hosting service. I wanted to mention that earlier. I use a hosting service called Buzzsprout. I put my podcast on there, and then Buzzsprout gets connected to iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and other mediums. But I know other people are using SoundCloud. They use that as their service, and I pay $12 a month for Buzzsprout. People are paying $15 a month for SoundCloud. There's a little bit of a cost for it, but it's been worth it just using them as my hosting service.
Well, Kimon, man, thank you so much for just allowing us to pick your brain, allowing your listeners who, as a list and listeners are expanding, just allow us to see, man, what does it take to get just from an idea to an actual place where we can share these ideas and create opportunities for other people. I've learned a lot. Hopefully a lot of our listeners have as well. I don't know if you have anything else to say, but we really appreciate it. Thank you.
No, man, thank you. Thank you for doing this. Other people have asked me about podcasting, and you came up with the idea of interviewing me. So this helps me. And anyone who's asked me about podcasting, I'll just send them this video. So that kind of makes things a lot easier. And those of you watching this, thank you for watching this. I want to just put the link up here one more time again for you. If you'd like to listen to past episodes of the podcast, or you would like to subscribe, go to KimonHinds.com/Ideas2Life. It's in the comment section. It's also going to be on your screen. Subscribe so that when you have the opportunity, you can make sure it's coming straight to your phone, your device is coming to your podcasting service. And listen, those of you who are thinking about something that you need to do to create content, man, do it. Somebody's waiting for you to come out in this space. I was just reading something yesterday that says the podcasting field is not saturated. Don't feel like it is. There's so much more content that needs to be created. So please do that.
All right, man. Well, we appreciate it. Come on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, y'all. Take care.